Hello, how are you? My name is Rafael Groman. I'm assistant professor of media studies at the University of Toronto, and we're on another DigiLabour book talk. Today, we'll be talking about Boom to Bust, How Streaming Broke Hollywood Workers. And here are the authors of the book, Miranda Banks and Kate Fortmueller. Miranda is a professor of film, television, and media studies at Loyola Marymount University. And Kate is Associate Professor of Film and Media History at Georgia State University. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. We're so happy to be here.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank
And we have
Daphne for inviting us.
And we have here Daphne Idiz, new assistant professor at York University and co-director of Creative Labor and Critical Futures Project. Hello, Daphne.
Hi, so excited to be here.
And we have people from audience. And hello, Lauren said hello, looking forward to the book talk. Tanner Miller said hello, congratulations, Miranda and Kate. Andres saying greetings from Belo Horizonte, Brazil, a place with the best food in Brazil. And after the presentation, Daphne and I will give some comments and questions, and we will open for questions from the audience. So yeah, Kate and Miranda, feel free to talk. The floor is yours.
Okay. All right. So thank you again to Raphael and Daphne for having us here. I'm going to kick us off to talk a little bit about, we'll start a little bit about where this book came from for us, and then we'll give a kind of brief overview. So the book for us really started in 2023 during the dual US writers and actors strikes. So during the strike, there were two separate strikes. They were just happening simultaneously. Both the Writers Guild of America and the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA, Screen Actors Associate, it's a combo, right, of the two different unions. They both walked out of their negotiations over the course of the summer against the AMPTP, which is basically a group of 350 signatories in the US, different producers who negotiate their contracts with the workers jointly.
So Kate and I kind of came to this project, both of us being very interested in film and television workers and the issues of kind of labor, creative labor, and both of us come at this both from a perspective of media industry studies, really specifically a lot of production studies work where we're looking at that industry from the bottom up, kind of looking at the lived experience of workers, how they describe their labor, both people above and below the line. And we also both emerge from film and television history, and both of us have a background in gender and labor. So in many ways, Kate and I were working together. Both of us had edited collections that we were writing for right at the moment that the strikes happened. And that became a really key way for us to connect and start talking about what we were seeing with this strike. So as we said, as part of this book emerged from a production studies methodology and media industry scholarship, also combined with looking at industry trades, things like Variety, Ankler, Hollywood Reporter, as well as local and national papers. And we did a lot of our research based on interviews with professionals, workers, coming from very, very different parts of the industry, whether they were early career, mid-career, or late career. We looked at people from 14 different professions, but also people of different, who are part of different identity groups and how they saw their experience working within Hollywood. And our starting questions were, what led to this strike? How did we get here? This was the first dual strike since 1960. And so it was an incredibly rare moment. And then we said, what brought these workers to this tipping point that two different unions at the exact same time would be going on strike? and then to think about what was changing in the work culture that led people to say, this is a moment that is worth us standing up and going on strike.
So to answer these questions, we looked at a few things. So we looked at industry finances, thinking about private equity investment. I would say Andrew DeWard's book, Derivative Media, was super helpful for kind of mapping that terrain for us. Also thinking about really the long-term impact of the zero interest rate period, which is when a lot of things were being made in the US or being financed by the studios. We'll get to that in a bit. But also thinking about sort of studio practices, right? The workflow, what are things that changed as the amount of things being made had ramped up as it did during this period. Thinking about changes in technology and streaming and digital distribution as being kind of one of those. But then I think a really big part of this, and I think this is like felt across the industry in different ways, is thinking about changes in how success was being measured. This kind of reliance on an algorithm to capture niche audience rather than mass, but also still needing to appeal to a mass group through your services, really kind of tipped certain metrics internal to the industry, but also in terms of these services. So the main thing that we're kind of pointing to in this, or how essentially like how far this book goes back, is to 2013. So really thinking about the moment when streamers became studios. They started producing films, TV shows, and documentaries. And in becoming studios, these streamers began to compete with the legacy media companies for audience attention. So initially they had, Netflix is a good one to point to here, but also Amazon and Hulu's a little bit different, but they were really relying on kind of like studio licensing to kind of build up their services. And the original productions were kind of complementing the old media that they were that they were relying on. But this was a big change in terms of how they were producing things. So essentially, right, so this kind of like gets to our argument here, right, is essentially that when streaming companies became studios, they began to compete in a really different way and sort of fundamentally change some of the structures of Hollywood. Okay. So all this to say, within this was a huge shift in how TV was made in a lot of ways. I know certain things, and I think this speaks to the like 22 episode seasons that were really common in the US, that is not the case in other countries. And people sort of point to it being kind of like, oh, well, that was what the British model was. But these changes to how TV was made, the increase in streaming original productions really started to contribute to a different culture of abundancy in terms of options for viewers that was being kind of referred to by industry leaders, workers, and also critics as a period of peak TV.
So before we talk about peak TV, because this is a really key point in our boom and in our book, which is the boom that we speak of in many ways, we need to define peak TV really quickly. So we want to take a minute and say, why TV matters so much to Hollywood. And let me slide over. So Hollywood is more well-known globally for films, but TV matters a lot to Hollywood studios and to Hollywood workers. So since the 1960s, Hollywood has been dependent on the TV industry as the real bread and butter work for people in production. One season of television could be 20 or 30 episodes that was being released week to week on broadcast. Film was bigger in terms of global impact or potential profits, but television, especially a television show, if it found a big audience, could generate absolutely enormous profits for studios licensing the show and for many, many workers. It could be work for years, 7 years easily for a hit show. And they were long-term employers, which is a huge shift. We'll come back to the slide a little bit later, but as you can see, the profits were massive for these things, and how much you could make. So one of the people that we interviewed, Lee Rosenbaum, said the only time you have more predictability than working on a TV show is if you have a client who's on a major franchise. So it was really, one of the keys to working in streaming was, or the rise in streaming is this shift that seemed to happen with peak TV. There was more TV. So it was, now what we can see is TV shows, which used to, you only used to have, about 4 networks that would create these number of shows. We suddenly see an increase in production of new shows, hundreds more shows that started about in the 2000s with an increase in cable series. And that reached an apex in 2022 in terms of the number of shows, 600 shows in 2022. John Landgraf, who ran FX, said, I long ago lost the ability to keep track of every scripted TV show. This is simply too much television. And he was saying that in 2015, long before we actually got to the peak in 2022. But the key here is for us to understand that the peak wasn't just streaming shows. There was also cable as well, which was a huge piece of this. And peak TV was a welcome boom in work. And as we talk about this, we just want to mention briefly, while COVID-19 kind of created a brief drop, the boom continued to 2022, but the peak was already starting to fall before the writers and actors went on the strike. So what we really tried to understand is there were so many different shows, many different companies trying to capture audiences. This led to a boom in production. And so for peak TV, Landgraf saw it as a warning, but for workers, it was a welcome boom. For audiences, many of us were really excited to see the diversity and variety of programming. But what we argue in this book is peak TV was not only unsustainable, it was a fast track for financial and worker burnout.
So yeah, this kind of gets to the one of the other questions, which we didn't talk about as our initial question, but really, if TV is good for Hollywood, why was peak TV ultimately bad for workers? So this kind of gets to, again, like everything that we are sort of interested in is thinking about what this means for workers. What does this mean for work? Those are where our questions are always going to kind of return to. And I think the main thing that we can sort of point to that we'll sort of stress here is that 3 of the ways that it changed work was that it kind of contributed to this like overproduction and kind of burnout culture. So kind of reiterating what Miranda mentioned, that this was not sustainable. It was a fast track for burnout. All of these things are part of this transformation. So it wasn't just about volume. It was about really qualitative changes to the industry between 2013 and 2023, we would say, because the work does, once they come out of the strike, there's a variety of other reasons that things are not picking up in the way that it should, or back to even a sustainable amount. Okay, so we have 3 different factors that we're going to point to here.
Very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly. Some of which are sort of good on some level, or at least this felt good at the time, and many of which ultimately were bad for workers and their experiences. So the first one, changes to financing. There's a couple of things to kind of like highlight here. One was that when streaming came in and had, seemingly endless funds. They were signing creatives and showrunners or producer writers to massive deals that have never been seen before in Hollywood. So thinking about Shonda Rhimes, 100 million for 4 years, Ryan Murphy, 300 million. But even like on the level of the festival circuit, Nate Parker's Birth of a Nation, which didn't sort of come to the success for various reasons, went for 17.5 million at Sundance when comparable films were selling for about 2.5 million. So there was a lot of money being thrown around. The other part of this is that Netflix was doing everything on this cost plus model, which is essentially they're paying the full cost of the show to produce it so that they have it for the future, and then they're giving producers a bonus, which then is preventing creatives from kind of benefiting from like the residual models and the kind of licensing models that used to be these kind of additional revenue streams that could keep things lucrative in the long term.
So the second point we want to see as this shift is changes to patterns of work. And that comes under a number of different things. So one of the kind of myths of Hollywood is really that working hard and working constantly means that you'll advance in your career. But in this peak TV era, the logic was that, the hope was that more TV would mean more advancement in your career. But in reality, while there were more shows, there were way fewer episodes. So you were getting, episodes first at 13 episodes on cable. Then we're looking more at like 8 episodes or 6 episodes. So you don't have as much work. And then also that means that many people were not getting as much experience. The difference of working a season on a show and seeing what happens over 22 episodes is very different than if you're working on a show that only has 8. So even though a camera operator works on a full season, you can't really, move up in rank. Or if you are moving up in rank, you're not coming with the same amount of experience that you would have had with doing that same job for about triple the number of episodes. So we really have this experience of more jobs, but not necessarily good jobs. People were also working a lot, but it was not on a reliable calendar. So we start seeing film and television calendars shifting. So films were being split into parts. Pirates of the Caribbean, Hunger Games. We had this kind of back-to-back filming of sequels that was happening. Kate and I talk about this a lot in the book, is a shift in calendars. So there used to be a very kind of like you could plan it in your life and lifestyle. When, as somebody working in TV, you would be on vacation, when would be intense times for work. Air dates used to keep productions on a very clear track. But what happened during this period of time is shows started getting made at any time. You could leap into pre-production or into production at any moment. And so there wasn't any seasonal alignment or schedule as there used to be, which meant that workers were often kind of jumping from gig to gig. So we started to see people leaving a show to go to another show and trying to get on another job before the next job was over in order to ensure that they had work when they were done. So we started to see this kind of pace of work changing that made, this kind of land grab for jobs, what we started to see there. And people wanted to do this because they didn't want to miss out on the amount of work that they could get. It meant you're shooting one show, you're prepping another, and if you can't actually be on the set yet, you can jump on a Zoom to make this happen. So there was this opportunity that led to a lot of overwork.
So different kind of opportunity. I think one of the things that's important to kind of remember, and I think in the US, in light of political changes in this country, this moment is not the moment we are currently in. But this period of peak TV really coincides with concern about the diversity of the industry and access for some. So it was a moment when people were encouraging new voices, a diverse group of voices, different creative backgrounds, training, educational kind of backgrounds to enter into the industry. So the industry was doing this by creating diversity fellowships, which in light of a lot of things with the executive order in the US have also had to change. But also thinking about really greenlighting niche stories. So one of the actors that and this is sort of like, was really exciting for a lot of people working in Hollywood. One of the actors we interviewed is talking about here that she'd rather do something niche with heart, something cool, something creatively fulfilling rather than kind of a ton of money. And there were enough opportunities at this time to actually do these. Some of these opportunities weren't great. In some cases, the budget was so low or the pay was so low, people are kind of going into debt or spending money in order to get these opportunities, like Beth Dover from Orange is the New Black. So the downside of bringing in so many new people into the industry who initially felt welcomed was that some of them were not necessarily prepared for the reality, which is you were welcomed by some but not others. Some were not being well paid and would ultimately become pretty disillusioned with these jobs, but also when the boom in hiring was not sustainable. So people who kind of came in, had jobs, maybe were left without careers. So some of the things that we also talk a little bit about in this book is some of the assumptions related to this work, which there's an assumption that that doesn't bear out that the industry is progressive. In reality, it's quite hierarchical. There is sort of assumptions about the value of creativity and unique voices. And also many people were being told that their voice matters, right? But that interest can change. And we have recently really seen a hard shift in diverse stories as the national political landscape has changed in this country.
So we have to put that all in the context of, all of the other things that happened to be going on in this moment as we go from 2013 into 2020. And this kind of boom leads to overproduction. And that is the moment where we see that peak TV really it was not only unsustainable, it was a fast track for financial and worker burnout. And really, it was a strategy to gain subscribers to streaming platforms, but it failed to generate revenue that could sustain an industry at this scale. So streaming really created this sense of vibrancy, optimism, a kind of gold rush mentality among executives, creators, and even us as audiences. But this excitement, as well as a lot of funding from Wall Street and major investors, masked economic insecurities, labor feeling overwhelmed, and really global industrial problems. So peak TV gave us a false sense of hope about the growth potential of that industry. And in this strategy to gain subscribers failed to generate revenue at scale. And in 2022, that bubble really starts to burst. And so what we really make clear in the book and, in this, this moment is that a lot of people blame the writer and actor strikes for the downturn. But really what happened was those dual strikes accelerated what was already happening in this industry. So where we are now, and what we're thinking about is a real moment of, what we talk about as a kind of boom to bust. And this is an incredibly complex and difficult moment that really was based not on problems that were kind of inherent to the industry, but because of this boom, we led to this massive downturn. But there are a lot of current pressure points that, we could talk about, in the next 20 minutes or so, but where our book really ends, and we kind of address some of these things at the end of our book, is, what are Hollywood workers thinking about now? These are unresolved, very current pressure points. And so, how does this industry stay sustainable for audiences? What do audiences want to see? But also there are, new economics that we're playing with. So the Paramount Warner Brothers merger, which if it goes through would lead to massive compression for labor, as well as a lot of headaches for those like for us nationally, globally, et cetera. We can talk about that more. But that is, in contention. And now that just this past week, 12 states have called to block it. Yesterday, the WGA came out with their lawsuit, and we're waiting for a potential EU response as well. One of the other pressure points, of course, is AI and how that's changing the industry. Kate and I are involved in some initiatives around that. And then there's also the increase in national and global tax incentives that changes the experience of work as well. So we wanted to kind of end this overview with the voices of two of the people that we spoke to that are, exceedingly talented young workers. What we found is that workers most of all want stability. And in a really volatile industry, those who are sustaining that work are really interested in looking for what they would think of as good work. So one of our interviewees, Haley Chavez, says, right now I'd rather be on a solid network show that is maybe safe in themes and tone. I just want to make, write silly jokes and make some money for it. Ricky Lark, who we also spoke to, we thought we'd end on his quote, where he said, "We didn't come here to become rich or famous. We came here because we love this shit. I came here with $40 and my mom made me lunch. And until I get down to $45, I'm not going back." And so we really think that this is the story of contemporary Hollywood, but how streaming has shifted work globally, and that there are more stories, not just for the impact of American workers here, but for global workers to tell as well of how things are shifting in the world of streaming. So thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me, yeah, we are back. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. If the audience wants to buy this book, it's available on the University of California Press website, and yeah, all this stuff. It's so interesting. Like for me, and I'm writing a book right now, also for University of California Press. And I think the type of topics we are dealing, we never end. The story is really like how to write in the middle of all these things happening. So this is really a challenge for like writing. I'll pass the ball to Daphne, and I'll ask the audience. Feel free to put your questions or comments or provocations here in the chat, and we will be answering soon. So we have here like Samuel Zarka from France. There's claps for Andrea here. There's someone who ordered a book right now. So yeah,
Nice.
There's something.
We can actually give a code too if somebody wants to order the book. If you use UCP Save 30 as a code, you get 30% off.
Excellent.
Well,
Go ahead, Daphne.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rafa, for organizing another fantastic DigiLabour book talk. Thanks so much, Kate and Miranda, for the presentation and just for producing this wonderful book. It's such an excellent analysis of sort of all of these, converging disruptions that led up to these historic strikes. And I think it's so helpful to really trace it back to that really pivotal moment when streamers start producing original content and all of the sort of things that we imagine that meant for work, and then seeing that play out with the sort of contextual changes like, peak TV, streaming wars, but also the pandemic, and now, of course, Gen AI. When I was reading this, I just kept thinking how badly I wished it had been out when I was working on my PhD. So I'm very happy to be able to have this conversation with you. I wanted to pick up, I had a few of my questions are things that you sort of raised already yourself in that last slide. So I wanted to kind of start there. And my first question is really to kind of reflect on how the strikes are remembered, because I think, they've become this really historic moment. It was, one of the biggest walkouts in Hollywood history. It was this dual strike that was quite unique, halted production for months, and also was like widely reported on because it was one of the first strikes around AI. And I think public memory of the strikes has really become very kind of fixated on that AI element. It became such a key, discourse in the news, on social media, also on the picket lines. But as you lay out in the book, the bargaining agendas were much broader, and it was really also very much about streaming residuals and all of these other sort of working condition issues. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your reflections on AI's role in the strikes, the extent to which you think they were, a really material concern versus more of a sort of rallying or mobilizing symbol, any sort of connections you see to other issues, and maybe how that tone has shifted since.
Yeah.
What I'll say, I'll start, and then maybe Kate, you can go in. But I think what's so interesting is when you ramp up to negotiations, you're doing it in a year before the actual negotiations. And we saw this with a couple of other labor groups too. So one of the really powerful things that happened before the dual strikes that I think is totally or mostly forgotten, except for people that are in the industry itself, was the below the line workers who almost went on strike a couple in 2021. And what happened there was that was a group IATSE has never, they're far more conservative in terms of not really going on strike. Some small groups have had labor negotiations, so IATSE has never gone on strike. Yeah. But that labor negotiation became incredibly intense. And in part, it became intense because of COVID. And COVID led to a lot of workers saying the rights of workers and the experience of workers is really problematic. Many of the problems that they brought up, some of these about overproduction, were actually not a part of their negotiation at all, because the negotiation had kind of started before COVID of what they decided they were going for. So there's a lot of anger from below the line workers and a lot of solidarity from other workers when the IATSE negotiations were going on. So IATSE approved its contract. But in 2021, there was this rumbling across the industry of worker solidarity, where people felt like there are a lot of concerns and a lot of worries about the nature of work that actually didn't end up in that negotiation, end up in the Writers Guild and Actors Guild negotiations. And one of those that, again, starts ramping up at that point is AI. So AI is in those contracts, but barely. But the time that contract is negotiated, AI becomes even more important. And the journalists who are covering it and everybody on the picket line really was talking a lot about AI, in part because AI is really understandable as a threat. But Kate, you
I was going to say, I think thinking about how the strike is remembered, I do think that it's really hard to separate at this point sort of like our popular understandings of AI and journalistic understanding of AI from this strike. And I think that's interesting in some ways, but I think I'll sort of just nod to, like, Miranda and I are doing some other interviews right now with choreographers and the Choreographers Guild. And I think that part of the thing that they're really concerned about is that people are talking about like voice and image, right? Yeah. Likeness, right? But movement is what choreographers are concerned about. But so much of how we understand like AI has to come from like the objectives of the labor unions in Hollywood. And those labor unions have their own workers and their own agendas and their own jurisdictions, and certain things might get left out of those conversations. So I do think that like we maybe haven't reflected on fully the legacy of like on some level. And I think, I mean, both of, I was going to say Raphael writes like great, and I was going to say, and I think Andre, and there's some AI voice actor scholars here that have written really well about and like thoughtfully and talked to lots of writers about sort of like the kind of worker-led movements of these things. And I think that's like particularly important, like and essential to think about in terms of AI. But then there's other things that when we're thinking about, especially the Hollywood unions, which are big and powerful, are there things that they are leaving out because it's advantageous to them in particular ways. So yeah, so I think there's sort of, this is like an ongoing, again, as you were saying, it's like, how do we ever put a pin in this? This is all ongoing. It's ongoing forever. New things kind of come up. And I think AI being technology that is developing so rapidly, we're constantly learning new things about that technology too. I mean, I think, again, like Raphael's sort of written about sports, right? Where like we're seeing movement and datafication of bodies in different ways. To what extent is that actually being ignored by SAG, which is also, right, mocap is datafying your body, but that's not protected in the same way. So yeah.
Yeah, with the game performers as well, and
Right.
the SAG-AFTRA, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just jump in here for yeah. One comment is with the tracker we did, we now put a more quantitative like analysis of what this overview. And it's interesting. Deserve probably a future special issue on the strikes legacy, because even people when they are not, they're putting Hollywood as a kind of we are not Hollywood. Like Hollywood became the kind of point of reference,
Yeah.
even to say we don't have the same resources, or we are struggling with other stuff, and also with all this memory about it is really interesting. I'm curious, and later there's a question from the audience as well about it. About the frictions and solidarities between different unions. And I know, like from the Hollywood Union's book as well, and now Daphne and I, we are seeing some of these things in our own research in Canada and Brazil as well.
Yeah.
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 Solidarity. Yeah. Well, I would say, like, actually for Miranda and I, solidarity is one of the, or we were both writing things for each other in different edited collections, but the first thing we wrote together was actually a piece for the Washington Post Made by History. It's now at Time, but it's like an academic sort of writing piece and it was about the history of solidarity. So one of the things that was super noticeable for us in this strike was the solidarity. And it was that moment of the rally at the shrine that was like about the WHA strike, but everyone else had sort of joined in. And it was just this moment. I mean, there's a history in the Hollywood unions of like, you know, the president of IATSE screaming at Ronald Reagan, president of SAG, and like, you're preventing us from working. So they're not always, this is not necessarily like worker, you know, like a sort of united and kind of worker solidarity group, right? These are, as we sort of say in the book, it's a very hierarchical industry. I think whether or not talent does rise to the top, there's a lot of people who are invested in that being, you know, their own positionality within it. So they're not always identifying as workers in the same way. So yeah, I was going to say, Miranda, do you want to say more?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. Like, even in-group workers, I mean, like historically, you know, I've written a lot about the Writers Guild, and there were many, many years where the biggest fights the Writers Guild had was between the Writers Guild East and the Writers Guild West, you know, or between TV writers and film writers. So there is, you know, solidarity is an incredibly complicated thing, and it's often fleeting, and also it's about different groups. There's also many people. So, for example, in that moment at the beginning of the Writers Guild strike, there was this, yes, we're all rallying together. And you saw directors and actors and writers and below the line workers, like, everybody was kind of in this conversation. But then the Directors Guild steps out and they make an agreement. And that's happened always. And it doesn't mean that every director doesn't care about these issues. There were lots of people who voted against, going with this, agreeing with the negotiation, because a lot of directors are also writers or actors, right? So, so the solidarity sometimes happens internally, but what happens with these guilds is each one of them has, as Kate mentioned, a really distinct mandate. And they're also structured incredibly differently. So the Directors Guild is weird. It is not just directors, right? There's all of these directors who might have certain ideas about their cozying up to executives and really wanting to feel as if they are, especially in the film world, a particular echelon of going, we're the closest to executives, we want to work with the studios. But there's also a lot of below the line workers that are a part of the Directors Guild. What makes the Writers Guild historically one of the most kind of easy to rally and kind of first in line to kind of stand guard is that the people in the Writers Guild are all writers. They all do the same job. And even within the Actors Guild, everybody is an actor at just different levels and in different ways. So the Directors Guild is structured very, very differently, and IATSE is the same way. So part of solidarity really has to do with whether or not you can gather together the group that you have and whether or not you have a cohesive idea of what matters or what you're willing to fight for.
I will say one more thing off of that that's also related to the AI legacy. You guys can imagine what writing this book was like. This was just Miranda and I all the time for 3 years on Zoom. But I think one of the things in terms of if we're thinking forward about sort of like the legacy of AI, I think one of the things also might be to try to look for how AI has put internal pressure points on the membership. I feel like the thing that I'm sort of starting to hear a little bit now is that voice actors are feeling abandoned by SAG-AFTRA, which is very funny because they have supported them through now 2 strikes in the last decade. Long strikes, right? I think the longest strike in SAG-AFTRA history still is the 2016-17 one. So it's, I think some of that has to do with their video game strikes, and the video game industry is really different in the US compared to the studios. But I think thinking about how AI might create different kinds of ruptures internally with these unions and pose different threats to solidarity. I think that's something to watch as part of this.
Yeah, for sure. We're seeing that very much with our research here as well. Just the kind of like intensification of, professional boundaries and identities and where my role ends and your role begins and that kind of thing.
Totally.
So I wanted to ask about, and you brought this up in your presentation, the sort of clash and tensions between assumptions and realities. And I think that, as people who do production studies and media industries research, this idea of imaginaries and beliefs and industry lore and how, distributors imagine audiences and how producers imagine different distributors and behave accordingly. And you sort of in the book really trace that like specific assumptions related to the streaming industries and sort of how there was this gap between the idea and the initial promise of like creative freedom and experimentation and big budgets, and then the kind of day-to-day reality, which was, worse compensation models, more precarity, shortened seasons, the sort of data-driven decision-making. And so I wanted to ask, sort of reflecting on where things were and where things are at today, if you think we've sort of reached the end or like demystified those particular assumptions related to streaming, or if you think they still persist in some ways. And if we have demystified them, maybe what some of the industry assumptions you're seeing today are.
I'll just start with like, in the book, we have kind of 3 assumptions, that I think that a lot of, we work at film. I work at a film school. I've worked at many different film schools. Like we're kind of selling
We went
this
to them. We
we
both
went to
yeah,
them.
went to film schools.
Yeah, there's and actually higher education today is very pre-professionalized. And a lot of these programs are designed as pre-industry, right? We're launching you into an industry, and there's this assurity. So I think film schools are building these assumptions. I think all these fellowship programs are building assumptions. All of these different kind of identity-based programs, studio-based programs like the Warner Brothers, writers program that's been around forever. There's three assumptions that we talk about in the book. One is that Hollywood work is lucrative. But what we really saw was, that started to disappear. Even working on a show, the shows were not. There weren't as many episodes, and because of streaming, there wasn't the residuals. A second assumption was more TV means more advancement. Again, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, that idea of like, you're not getting as much on-the-job training if a show is significantly shorter. And then that third assumption is that your voice matters. And that really is part of that shift of, in a lot of different ways, that we moved from a model. Historically, there was a model of, when you work to try to get a show, like an episode of a TV show, yeah, you'd write your own original script, but you'd also do a script of a show that already existed to show that you could write in somebody else's voice. And what really started to change during this period of time that we were watching is they weren't interested in seeing that you could write somebody else's voice. They were interested in your own voice, that, oh, what's your story that you can contribute? And so there was a lot of praise and affirmation for the original pilot and new shows. But as we've seen, especially in the kind of cultural climate in the country has shifted, political climate has shifted, those original voices, those new voices, often from people of color, that we really start to see disappearing. So that sense that your voice matters set up another myth. So I'll stop there, and then maybe Kate.
Well, yeah, I guess the thing I would really just add is there are some things that we're never going to get rid of. I was watching the first version of A Star Is Born last night from 1937, and it's like, yep. Almost 100 years and this myth is still going strong. It's still like, you can be told, 1 in 100,000 chance, and you show, like, there's just certain things that no matter what the industry says, no matter what data you show people, there's an allure to Hollywood, there's an allure to storytelling, and I think that it is sort of interesting. I think one of the shifts, and I will say, I see a comment in the chat about Kay Dickinson's Supply Chain Cinema. We love that book, love her work. It is cited. A lot of what we were doing in this book was, I think, we're like, she is talking about this in a British context, and there are some specific differences to it in the US context. So we were really trying to delineate, like, both celebrate as much as possible her work, but also to kind of delineate where we kind of see differences in the US. Yes, all the applause to that book. And yes, tell her we said that. But yes, I think that there are certain things that you're just never going to really break because they're kind of intrinsic to the industry. And so part of like what we're doing, speaking of the like ongoing journey of this work, is that we're always sort of thinking about if those are still kind of myths that are present, right? How do they get modified? How do people sort of negotiate them? How do they get reinvigorated for a new moment? Like, I feel like the joke for a while when I was teaching about a decade ago was like, that like getting discovered at the soda counter is now, whatever, pick your social media site. You're going to get developed and launched into a career from YouTube, from Snapchat, from TikTok, right? So we just reinvent some of these myths. But there were some specific ones in this moment, I think, that are different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you
sorry.
have more questions.
I do have a couple more questions, but I didn't want to interrupt if you had something you were.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. So then, no, I mean, I think this kind of raises another question, bringing up, the different contexts and how like everything, of course, is also incredibly context specific. In my own research, I've looked at sort of streaming and Gen AI and the impacts on screen labor in different parts of Europe, now in Canada, and also with Raphael doing the sort of voice actors project in Brazil. And so, everything is, of course, very dependent on the particular, cultural, regulatory, industrial environment that you're researching. And Hollywood is such a unique situation. The sort of power that Hollywood unions have is sort of not replicatable anywhere else. They have a very, distinctive bargaining system. And so I'm curious sort of what aspects of your research and this book you see as being very, uniquely Hollywood, and also thinking, Kate, I know you're based in Atlanta. There's sort of production hubs outside of Hollywood, even within the US. So kind of, I guess, where you situate lessons that can be, taken from this elsewhere, or things that are very Hollywood specific.
That's a good question. I'm like, let me think about this. Hollywood specific. I think there are. I think first I would sort of say like what happened in Hollywood in the 30s is probably not even replicable today, right? It's very much a specific like historical period in time that allowed for the kind of union organizing that happened. And I don't think I think anyone who's trying to get a contract or organize a union now is being met in the US with a lot more resistance. Like you kind of have to join one of those existing, to get your jurisdiction kind of covered, you have to join an existing union. So I think the things, I think out of these strikes, I feel like that sort of initiated some interesting conversations with people for me, like in other parts of the world. So I think maybe one of the things, it's not necessarily transferable, but I think there was an interesting, I guess one of the other things I'm like noticing, and I think maybe this is just that this is a very labor focused group, but I also think there is more, we used to think of Hollywood's like, well, Toby Miller says this in Global Hollywood 2, or Toby Miller or somebody else in Global Hollywood 2 talks about that our greatest export, Hollywood's greatest export, is its division of labor or mode of production. And I think that is true. And I've thought that was true for a long time. But I think that most people historically have thought about it as our films. And I think that what has happened with these strikes and in this moment, especially with like with Netflix going and spending everywhere in the world, and trying to change workflows around the world. I think that one of the things that has become more interesting to scholars, to organizers, to people working in various labor groups is understanding what actually does work in Hollywood and how has it worked and how did those things change. So I think it's maybe not transferable, but I think that the work that kind of looks at that stuff can be useful. Like, I feel like there's something really like nice about writing something where you're like, I think this is useful. And I think this could be useful to multiple tiers of people is sort of a big, it's like, that's my bar for anything. It's like, can this be of use to somebody? Ideally, can this be of use to somebody who's not a tenured professor at a university, I guess is sort of, I think that's kind of how I would answer it. So I think there's a lot, but I do think there's a lot that's Hollywood specific in this book. I will say, Miranda, do you want to talk about Frank Spotnitz?
Yeah, so one of the things that's been really interesting that started, around 2010s, it existed before, but we started to see a lot more kind of interest by Hollywood workers kind of doing what was the opposite of what was happening in, the 20s, but then the 30s of this move from Hollywood people going into Europe or going to other countries. And part of that was about production moving overseas, and more international production. But there started to be a lot of conversations about worker experience and worker exchange. So, former heads of the Writers Guild or the Directors Guild would start meeting with the French Writers Guilds and Authors Guilds. And so there was an increased interest especially in Europe, but it was happening elsewhere. And Dave Hessenholch and I kind of tried to track some of this, looking at musicians as guilds and unions, as well as Hollywood creatives, that was really starting to happen, about not saying like, hey, you can export not just our division of labor, but our labor laws or rules. But there was at least a conversation about how can we build on labor rights, American labor rights in other contexts. Not saying that the US system has always been best by any means, but there was a continued conversation about that really started, I think, mostly in the 2000s. And so building on that, as we start to see even more global exchange of film, but especially of television, then there is even more conversation and also building on that system. So we interviewed Frank Spotnitz, who was most notably, an X-Files writer and producer, but also did Man in the High Castle. And he has kind of built a whole system of teaching interested writers and aspiring producers about the U.S. system of writing through a program that he calls Serial Eyes, like Serial Eyes, but it's Serial Eyes, that's based out of Germany, and inviting young creatives into learning the system. But I think what you're pointing at is really more about the labor exchange. And I think that that's happening in Korea. There's been increased interest in conversation about worker rights, and the importance of worker, compensation, as these global multinationals are really taking hold. Netflix especially, so that Netflix workers, no matter where you're working in the industry globally, really are trying to share information and trying to build shared rights, because Amazon workers are working everywhere, right?
Yeah.
So now that no matter if you're a showrunner or, a delivery person, you are an Amazon worker, you are a cog in the Amazon wheel. And I think there's opportunity for solidarity that needs to be built on in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And just a short comment about the gig worker in Hollywood as gig workers, because originally the term gig came from arts and culture sector, and yeah, this is really important to say, like, well before platforms or something like that.
Yeah,
Right, Daphne?
we've been at the forefront of
Yeah, of course.
like,
Yeah,
terrible conditions.
just one comment to the audience. Unfortunately, Joe Epstein could not join us today. Probably in the future, but just for you who are like waiting for Joey, Daphne, if you have more question.
Yeah, no, and I mean, just to go back to that point, I think the other part of why streaming is like such an interesting thing is because it sort of exported that US model to so many different parts of the world. And so like that was something that was coming up a lot in my research, where they were like, we never had a showrunner before, but Netflix would show up and say, we want a showrunner. And so, those kinds of like sort of ripple effects that you don't necessarily foresee, but that streaming kind of intensified or sped up.
But they don't want to pay like that. All right.
No.
Is like then, and that was sort of one of the things that we were talking about with Frank Spotnitz, is that he was like, they want this model, but like they want this model is they want to eliminate this model in the US because it's too expensive. So it's a weird,
exactly,
weird tension of like we recognize that this is great in some ways, but not that great.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also like on the labor side, that kind of aspect of like, yes, more global solidarity and unions talking, but also the like reality of a lot of dependency on the US, especially like here in the Canadian context, like the Writers Guild of Canada, their members are often like part of the WGA as well. And same for ACTRA, which is the actors union here. And so there is this sort of sense that like, we have to like look to what the US unions are negotiating and sort of think about that as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I wanted to bring up the merger, the big news this week. Well, this big news that's been ongoing, but that came up again this week. And again, the Writers Guild, who's just yesterday sued about the consolidation. So, perfect time to pick your brains about this. And I think something you do amazingly in the book is really show how these like struggles don't happen in a vacuum, that they're shaped by these much bigger, industry dynamics that are going on. And so I wanted to ask, I also saw that you were working on this report that just came out that's related to the merger. So I figured bring in the experts and ask them about it. So I wanted to ask sort of what you think some of the biggest labor concerns are with the merger, and how much you think collective action can really accomplish when facing these kind of big, industry consolidation efforts.
I feel like we can answer those in two parts: the Hollywood part and the outside of the downstream outside of Hollywood. Miranda, do you want to take half of that? I'll take the Atlanta side. Take the Hollywood side.
Sure. Yeah. Do you? So there was mention of Kate and I have been involved in a really amazing project that started a few months ago, kind of emerged from Andrew DeWard and Shauna Kidman and their work at the Macro Lab. And they are really interested in the kind of impact of consolidation on creativity and work and the economics of the industries, not just in terms of film and television, but really broad, from comic books to the music industry, et cetera. And together there's a group of, I believe we're about 22 or so researchers, from full professors to graduate students, who gathered together to try to articulate the costs of consolidation and arguments. We built the arguments and evidence for blocking the Paramount Warner Brothers merger. And it is 14 reasons why this merger is a terrible idea. So we're really trying to build out the arguments to try to support those who may be fighting against this merger. And Kate and I jointly wrote the piece about the impact on labor, but there's also political discourse, sports, library and public access, video games, animation, distribution, foreign ownership with the FCC, et cetera. So there's, it's really worth a read and a really amazing kind of document. And I think an example of a group of researchers who are really trying to be involved in in trying to fight this political, move, economic move, but also really a political move.
So yeah, okay. So I will just sort of say quickly. So in the document, we kind of outline some of the problems for labor, but I think mainly that you'll have fewer, you're going to have fewer buyers, and this is the crux of the issue for the WGA lawsuit. Is so Paramount and Warner Brothers, who have never made more than 20 films combined in a year, are saying, "Oh, we're going to make 30." There's no way. There's no reason to believe this. They need to, they've overspent, right, in the war against Netflix. Ellison way overspent, and so now then needs to find a ton of cuts immediately. So the cuts always come from labor. Cuts are not going to come from building out more infrastructure to hire more people. I think this is particularly maybe. We're at least I'm sort of looking at the summer box office, and you're seeing, a lot of these are YouTube horror movies or whatever happening, at least in the US, everyone is seeing Obsession and, stuff like that these aren't kind of coming from established IP. So I feel like there could be a moment where you're oh, maybe it's time to look to some new voices. That will not happen under this kind of structure, I think, is one of the huge concerns. The thing I would sort of flag in terms of speaking of, so I live in Atlanta, Georgia, which is across the country from Los Angeles, way south from New York. So we're not a conventional media hub. However, we kind of are, because we have Ted Turner. So Ted Turner, who Turner Network, CNN, he started those companies in Atlanta. And so there has always actually been like an outsized, I would say, cable presence in Atlanta, Georgia. There's sports. You see stuff. There is a World Cup game happening right now. I'm sorry for anyone, or maybe people are second screening it right now. I don't know. But so that hub, and through a variety of different mergers over the past, especially kind of right around the time I moved here a decade ago, that when Warner Brothers was part of a merger, and that was the acquisition of CNN, then leads to more kind of layoffs. So at this point, I think there's a lot of concern about what happens when you bring together CBS and CNN. Will that be laying off workers in Atlanta? Sort of all of that, right? So I think that there's ways that it's not just about sort of Hollywood films and television and those studios. It really is like about news, and it really is about these production cultures that have popped up in other parts of the country, and how they will be impacted if this goes through. I think the thing that we keep telling ourselves, even though I think that it's hard to believe in antitrust regulation in this country, but we have to keep telling ourselves this is not inevitable. It has not happened. There are lawsuits pending. Many people could join. The WGA edition was quite surprising, I would say. Of all the unions, I'm not surprised, but I would love to sort of talk to a legal historian as to whether or not that there's precedent for something like that. So
yeah, it's super fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh no, go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to jump to the audience question. So yeah, definitely if you want to ask one more thing or.
No, please. I mean, I can jump back in later, but I would love to hear what the audience has to say.
Great. We have this comment from Rafaela. She's from Catholic University of Rio. She also works in the industry at Globo, one of the major TV company in Brazil, and definitely going to buy the book. I think the process you described is also already starting to happen here in the country. And there is a question from Brazil. How do you think this global shift in streaming might affect audiovisual workers in countries that rely on foreign investment to sustain local production? And it's Gustavo. In Brazil, for example, most foreign production companies that set up operations to create original streaming content no longer produce script fiction focused on instead of reality TV or sport matches or this reality TV expansion. I'll say. I don't know if you have insights.
Yeah. I mean, reality TV, sports, verticals.
Yeah.
Right. So we're seeing whatever is the cheapest thing to make, whatever's the fastest thing to make. That's where they're going right now. And it's very scary. But on one side, I feel like there's faith in audiences that are looking for more than that, as we slowly see. But yeah, no, I think these are really, really important questions, and I think go back to what we were talking about earlier about how do workers build connection across countries as these same conglomerates are in kind of funding or not funding creative labor.
Yeah, I have an anecdote from my own research about it. We just launched a campaign with voice actors last week or so, 10 days ago, with 500K views in this 10 days, with a famous Mexican actor commenting. And what we did is two Brazilian famous voice actors, and we did featuring with other voice actors association around the world. So NAVA in the US, the German Voice Actor Association, the Indian Voice Actor Association, and the Chile one. So they dub it in their own language, one line. So this is my voice in English. This is my voice in Spanish. This is my voice in German. And the anecdote was, I tried to contact, it was my role, like the voice actors directed the creative part. And so the University our role was to get in touch with the other voice actors association. And there was the Portuguese one from Portugal. And the president was so angry with me, saying, why you Brazilian/Canadian are interested in Europe Portuguese thing? I'm not participate on it. And so I talked to the Brazilian voice actors, so I got it because they say Brazilian voice actors get all the job from Portugal as well. So it's hard to form solidarity between Brazilian and Portuguese voice actors. So this kind of failure in this campaign shows a lot about like all this stuff.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Kate, if you want to.
Yeah, no, yeah, I was gonna say, it's like when you're competing for actual work and like paying your rent, like these things get personal. I think I would sort of say, like, in terms of thinking about like if you're seeing some of the same things here and like how things are shifting production, like these streaming companies put a lot of money, and in doing so, I mean, actually, Hollywood's been doing this forever, right? Hollywood in the 30s would steal actors and directors from European countries and sort of bring them to make, Hollywood movies, right? There's long histories of that, right? But I think there is a sort of way that like investing a lot of money and then sort of skewing the market towards streaming companies such that it is not sustainable or sort of like feasible to make things like within your own local economy is ultimately going to be pretty destructive, when they stop paying big money. And I think, I don't know, I'm thinking of the Korean example, for example, like Korean actors are trying really hard to have conversations about residuals. There's some legal barriers to that. There's lots of, as Daphne mentioned, there's lots of like local context specific problems with that. But one of the other problems is that Netflix won't sit down with them at all because they don't need to. So I think I don't really know what to say other than like, there might be a kind of a pattern or a lesson learned from how this happened in Hollywood of like what those big kind of financing deals do towards ultimately kind of decimating what was a pretty good workable national media industry for many, many years. So yeah.
I will say, I think the one thing that like outside of Hollywood we're seeing a lot of is sort of policy intervention and regulation geared at streaming services. And that's where you will see the sort of intervention where they'll say you have to invest in a certain kind of content and defining that content, which is, rife with all kinds of other challenges because how do you define what that content should be? But that's where you're seeing that that possibility of sort of setting those.
And we won't do that in the US. We will, however, invest in more tax incentives.
Of course.
But we will hope very much that other countries will create those barriers.
Yes.
There's a question from Samuel from University of Sorbonne, Samuel Zaka. Let me rephrase my question. Do you think the dual strike of 2023 gave WGA and SAG-AFTRA a lasting position of strength vis-a-vis the studios?
Okay, so I think I will start with one thing that Miranda and I, like, as I mentioned, we were talking to choreographers and the Choreographers Guild. And I think one of the things, so they recently got they got a voluntary recognition from SAG-AFTRA. So they got their first contract. Choreographers have never been unionized in the US, or not never. They were briefly unionized in the 40s, but they have not had a contract, so they're kind of excluded, which is weird to think about when you think of like a choreographer on set as a directorial kind of role, right? Also not organized in the UK. This is speaking of transnational sort of solidarities and organizing. But one of the things that has happened, I would say there's a couple things that are beyond just the strike. Carol Lombardini, who is the president of the AMPTP, much not loved, I don't know, very hated person. We talk about her a little bit in our book. One of the people we interviewed, Billy Ray, a screenwriter, was like, she's there to say no. All she does is say no, basically. So there is some change in the leader. So I think there's a few things that happened. One thing was a change in the leadership of the AMPTP, I think has shifted some of the power and the kinds of conversations that maybe the studios are willing to have with the labor unions. The current head is this guy, Greg Hessener, who he actually comes from a labor background. So he has experience on both kind of labor and employer sides as like a labor guy. So I think he's sort of coming at this in a really different perspective. So those are the kinds of things that, it's not like a clear policy thing, but if we were to think about these things as like why personality matters and why kind of key figures matter, this is someone who does sort of matter in that room. So we've only had one round of negotiations with him. We'll see. But they had some voluntary recognitions. I think as a result, they kind of gave up, and now their contracts are 4 years, not 3. So there's certain things that, a negotiation is always give and take. So there's certain things that I think have changed. I think that still a lot of workers are upset because they're hurting still, because strikes are hard. Nothing has really bounced back. So I think people are sort of still, there's like on the one level these are comments I can make sort of like broad level structural questions, but I think if you ask people in Hollywood, I don't think they would say that they gained anything. I think they would say it was a bad idea. Like, I think there's still a lot of hurt from 2023, even though we have been through another round of negotiations.
The last question here is a good one. How do you justify to yourself as to reviewers, to editor, when to cut off, periodize your research, or how do you navigate comments that you need to examine, cover more content to cover a topic?
Oh, that is such a great question. I love it. Can you keep the question up there just for another minute?
Yeah.
I want to make sure there's a lot of different pieces there. I mean, part of it is justifying to ourselves, like when to cut off. And again, that's why when we were thinking about, how do we shorten this book talk down, to really say like, okay, what is the period? And part of the periodization for ourselves is what was the inciting incident that we can see that something really changed. And we see a ramp up before then, but we chose 2013 as the starting point because that was the moment of original streaming. And we saw that as a key moment on that side of the periodization. The cutoff is always when your book deadline is, and it's like, when is the book due to press? And even then, as we were finishing the book, Kate and I had our very final copy edits. We were only supposed to be changing lines in the book when we found out about the merger. And so we made a very special request to the press to say, can we add a paragraph about the merger? And we just said, please, this is so relevant to what's happening. And they were, UC Press is an amazing press. Huge thanks to everybody there. That's been wonderful. But they said, yeah, you can write a paragraph. So it is, we had to justify that this was so significant. You always are kind of trying to find an event, before that is the end. In that last section, we really talked about fires, the LA fires, and ICE coming to, nationally, but also to LA as a way to periodize the research. Just as a way to think about it. We also very clearly, even though, Kate is in, Georgia, and we talk about a US context, we really clearly made this book Hollywood because there's so much more to cover on a national scale in these issues. And as well, we're very aware that this is a US kind of focused book, but hopefully written in a way that is relevant and useful and compelling for a conversation that we are really, really eager to have with other scholars, researchers, as well as creatives who are working elsewhere. Because I know for me and my research, I've always been really, really passionate about, I know Hollywood, but in my work in the production studies books, I love, writing. I've loved editing those books because it's allowed me to have a global exchange with researchers who are covering other countries that I don't have the expertise in. So I feel like that being able to kind of periodize your research, navigate to the specificity of what we're doing. And then I think also it's about who do we choose to cite and kind of point people to and saying, here's other things to read, as we talk about things, and really say, there's so much more to do. So I don't know, those are some of my thinking on it, but it's a really great question, a really, really important one, because you cannot do it all.
I will say I'm going to add two things to these. First of all, in terms of thinking about justifying your periodization and cutoff, I do think that there's a difference between writing something, especially something contemporary, or doing these things by yourself versus doing it in collaboration with someone. So Miranda and I wrote, I feel like people are either very impressed or very horrified. We wrote this entire book on Zoom, in Google Documents, talking through and writing over every single word. So your mileage may vary in that model of collaboration, but it worked for us. We definitely did. We talked actually about does this book start with the 7/8 WGA strike, or does it start peak TV? So the periodization was intentional and the subject of many discussions. With respect to reviewers, I should say we had fantastic reviewers, but I really need to shout out Elisa Perrin, who's at University of Texas. She outed herself very early as a reviewer of this book. And I think she was really the one, this book had a different title. And this is the beauty of when you have a reviewer who really kind of gets what you're doing and gets the project. And I think really she was this book is this is not about the strikes necessarily. This is about peak TV. And I think that helping sort of frame that helps with strengthen your periodization, helps really justify what you're talking about and where you don't need to go in certain directions because you have this frame, but also you have the reviewer on board. I was going to say, this is part of the film media line, which I think there's also the digital line, and they're different editors. But we also had a lot of conversations with our editor about scope and tone and kind of things, what the audience for this book would be. And that's also part of those conversations, I think, too. So yes. So shout out to our wonderful collaborative writing model and Elisa Perrin always, for being a great reader.
Our style of writing was incredibly collaborative, and I think also speaks to writing contemporary history. It's like whack-a-mole. You're just constantly, the news would be coming out, and we're rewriting things. But yeah, again, Elisa was incredible in terms of helping us hone in on what we were trying to do and what we were not really trying to do. And those questions are just so important too when you're working on a project, is being clear not just what you want your book to be, but who you don't want it. What you don't want it to be, and also who is your reader. I think we don't talk enough about that in our field, is really thinking about how are we writing to the reader that we want, and how are we opening the door for a conversation? Because I think for both of us, Kate and I are really clear, we want this book to be a conversation. We're so excited to be part of this conversation here, because it is such a global community, and that's so vital for us, because we really feel like so many of the things that are coming up in this book are things that we're eager to see and we're eager to learn about that are happening elsewhere. We see this as a kind of provocation for a conversation rather than a totally finished product.
Amazing. Yeah, especially talking to early career researchers, like master's students or PhD students, there's a kind of attention economy right now with research, and people sometimes I receive some questions saying, why you don't research this topic? I said, yeah, because there is a community of researchers and we are doing these things together. I don't need to address all the research topics because really it's the collaboration what matters. And for me, this is a powerful message for us to continue to build. Daphne, Kate, and I will be in Mexico in October for a panel, Canada, Brazil, and US. And yeah, so thank you so much For those who attended, thank you, Miranda, Daphne, Kate. The next online DigiLabour book talk will be in September with Clarissa Redwine and GS10. They are launching a book called Against Tech Oligarchy, Worker Resistance in the World's Most Powerful Industry, about tech worker organizing, and more soon. Thank you, Miranda, Kate, Daphne.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the great questions, Daphne.
Thanks. So nice to talk to you both.
Love it.